Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. It is the daily. It is Tuesday, and Bill Landis is back with me once again. We're going to look ahead to spring camp and take some stock of a position group. And this one has a new position coach and a lot of intrigue because Ohio State wants to use their tight ends in multiple ways and in multiple different personnel groups. And they've got potentially the ability to do that with Cade Stover and Joe Royer coming back and G. Scott and a handful of others. So let's just dive right into it, Bill. What do you make of this tight ends group as a whole heading into March?
They're really interesting, which might sound a little weird coming from me, someone who has spent multiple off seasons publicly questioning why we ever talk about this position group, but because they just they're not used in a way that makes them interesting all the time within this offense. But that does not mean that they aren't important to what Ohio State wants to do. But I find this particular collection of guys they have coming back fairly fascinating, and when you throw in the fact that they do have a new position coach in Keenan Bailey on top of that, it's even more so. They're going to need this group to be really good this year. For myriad reasons, because of the changes on the offensive line, because of the new quarterback, maybe frankly because of what they might try to do in the run game that could potentially be a little different with Justin Fry taking things over as run game coordinator. So even if they're not a position group that is probably not going to catch 30 passes or 40 passes a year, they remain important nonetheless, and probably as important as they've been here over the last couple of years. Maybe the last time they were this important was probably back in 2019 when Justin Fields was the quarterback.
Yeah, we don't have to have the same offseason conversation that is tradition at Ohio State, projecting the number of catches for them. Keenan Bailey made some references to how much production that Ohio State could get out of Cade Stover with one more year. We saw that at times before he got that hip injury, mostly in the first half of the season, where it was like, holy cow, this is 3, 4, maybe 5 balls a game that he could get, especially as he gets more familiar with the offense and CJ Stroud trusts him more. And we saw them try to do that, and it sort of tapered off as the season went along. And then when you add Joe Royer into that conversation, he fits in the Ruckert. We've been making those comparisons since the moment he arrived and working closely with him because he was more of a wide receiver and not a pure tight end, developing strength, learning how to block before you can get on the field. Like, those two guys have the ability to catch a lot of footballs. Now, will they? Comes down to the same conversation again that we always have. Where would you place those guys amongst the dangerous weapons that Ohio State has?
Yep.
That used to be Kevin Wilson's conversation. They're not going to go ahead of Marvin Harrison Jr. They're not going to go ahead of Emeka Ibuka. Probably not going to be ahead of Julian Fleming. Xavier Johnson fits in that, then the running game. So, I think it's fine if they catch 1 or 2 passes. I got this question once I posted a story on Monday at ohiostate.rivals.com. Like, will Keenan's background lend itself to the tight ends being more receiving threats than blockers? And I think the answer to that is no, even though he can certainly improve those guys in that regard and has worked with Brian Hartline. When they use 2 tight ends, it's going to be to help the running game. And I think that's primarily what they're going to work towards. And Keenan Bailey spent last season getting a lot of work with Justin Fry and Mike Solini in the offensive line group, I think in large part so that he was prepared to teach that to the tight ends this year.
This is more of a theory than that I haven't actually looked up, so it could very well be wrong. But I would imagine that the years where Ohio State has seen a slight uptick in receiving production from the tight ends has probably coincided with a veteran quarterback who is more willing to throw the ball over the middle of the field. And if either Kyle McCord or Devin Brown is less inclined to do so in their first year as a starter, that wouldn't shock me. Justin Fields didn't throw the ball over the middle of the field a ton in his first year as a starter. I just think that's something you grow into as you learn to read defenses better. So that will probably cut into whatever receiving production we project for the tight end group this year. But I think that is an interesting question given Keenan's background, because Ohio State, for Kevin Wilson was here 6 years coaching the tight ends. His background is in offensive line play, and the usage of that position leaned far more to that direction than it did to the receiving direction. Could that balance out a little more because Keenan has more of a skill position background? Maybe. I'm not on alert for it, but it's not impossible. If it were to happen, you would think it would happen with a guy like that coaching the position. But to your point, he spent a ton of time with the offensive line guys last year, probably for a reason, probably because in the back of Ryan Day's mind, I would assume he thought if Keenan were to be elevated, this was probably the most likely spot for him to be elevated on the offense this year. So he needed that if I don't want to call it expertise because he only did it for a year, but he needed that experience working with those guys. And I'm sure that Mike Soleni and Justin Fry will probably still be fairly hands-on with that position group, trying to teach them the finer points of blocking. But Keenan's like encyclopedia of knowledge with all the different positions he's worked with. If you can kind of pick and choose things from all those spots that I think would help the tight end group in the long run. So if that is a more well-rounded position group this year, I don't think I'd be terribly surprised by that.
No, and that would be a good thing. We've talked about that. If Ohio State, I think deep down, Ryan Day's philosophy is 2 tight end sets roughly a third of the time, and what that if you can get more flexibility and versatility to occasionally use them to expand the passing attack, that's all for the better. But when we've seen Ohio State really run the ball effectively, and I think that Farrell Ruckert combination was the best one from recent memory. I mean, that's recency bias, but you look at the combination of what they both provided, a lot of wide open rushing lanes to the perimeter with those two crashing down. I remember the Michigan State game vividly with some plays there where they were monsters blocking up front, and you have to be on alert if the possibility exists that you could flank out someone like Joe Royer, or what Cade Stover can do with the football in his hands. That creates problems for defenses when you are able to go with that personnel grouping. We'll see what transpires there. I think they have just about the only thing maybe they don't have compared to years past is this Mitch Rossi true fullback role. I don't know what they'll do, if that will go by the wayside. I was thinking about this before we started. I was like, how crazy is this idea? Like, what if that was how Chip Trayanum's career evolved? Like, he became it's an off the wall idea. I'm not suggesting that that's happening in the Woody Hayes Athletic Center at all right now. But what if? Like, that seems like that could be a nice solution for everybody.
Yeah, so I didn't realize this. Mitch Rossi was listed as 250 pounds last year.
Yeah, he was a big dude.
He's a big dude. Yeah, I don't know. I would not have guessed that. I would have guessed more like 230, 240. Chip himself is listed as 230, and he's a pretty big guy himself. That's interesting. I don't know that I've thought of that, but I can see the vision there, and also too, if you're Chip, we've talked about this. He's kind of caught in between. If he goes a linebacker, he's buried by a couple of guys. If he goes the running back, at least for the time being, he might play a lot. But in the fall, once Mayan Williams and Trayvon Henderson are back, he'd be buried a little bit too. There's not a fullback on the roster, and I know that's a position that is fallen out of custom, I suppose, across football. But Ohio State has found a way to utilize it and utilize it pretty well the last couple of years with Mitch. So if I were Chip and they approached me with that, I'd be like, I don't. Guy caught a couple passes, scored a couple touchdowns. I don't know. Maybe I think it'd be better to be that than to be like the 5th running back.
Yeah, that's what I like. He's not going to get a ton of snaps at linebacker. He's going to be low on the pecking order at running back. I think it's an interesting idea, and we never really know where to put that. Like, we're probably going to be talking about Chip again in the running back conversation whatever episode of the Daily that is. But I just thought it was an intriguing idea because that's not something that Ohio State's going to do with G. Scott. I don't think that, Sam Hart and Bennett Christian are very good blockers and certainly athletic guys. But, Mitch had a running back background and skill set that he brought to that tight end position. It was a great hybrid. And maybe they don't want it at all. I don't know. But if somebody was going to fill that role for Ohio State, I would think it would have to be somebody like Chip Trayanum because you've got G. Scott trying to do some other things and work into the mix. I think we'd agree that he would be probably the 3rd tight end in this group moving forward. Going to battle that a little bit with Joe Royer. I don't know where you fall on who the most interesting guy in that group is, but yeah, it's a conversation that almost certainly has to come down to either G. Scott or Joe Royer in my mind.
The most interesting guy in that room to me is probably Royer. I just don't know. The G. Scott sort of, it's more than an experiment now because he's settled into that role. But I am not on alert for him to all of a sudden become like a dynamite inline blocker to the point where he is the number 2 tight end and he's playing I don't know, 25 snaps a game alongside Cade Stover. I think he's more of a guy you sprinkle in from time to time when you want to try to exploit a mismatch in the passing game. And if I'm wrong on that, then that means that G took a tremendous step forward as a blocker, and good for him. And while Joe Royer, I think, is maybe a similar athlete in the sense that he was also a high school receiver, I feel like in very small sample sizes, I like a little bit more of what I've seen from him as a blocker. So I would think that he'd be the number 2. Remember, like 2A and 2B. I don't know, but Joe Royer is. There's a reason why this time last year we all kind of thought he was going to be the starting tight end. We were not fully in the world of like Cade Stover is the guy yet, and it was like a natural progression, I think, for Joe Royer to be in that conversation. And then the season kind of went sideways for him, and he had the personal stuff that he was dealing with, and it just never came together. But I don't like he didn't get worse as a football player. And I don't know if I think I might have mentioned this on one of the other dailies. Like I was watching the spring game recently because I was looking at the quarterbacks, and Joe Royer had like a super athletic touchdown catch in that game where he ran down the seam and elevated and high pointed a ball from Kyle McCord. It was like a kind of thing where you like take a second, like, oh wow, like you forget that they have that kind of athlete in the tight end room in Joe Royer. So he's really interesting to me. I think you know what Cade is and what he can be. I think for the most part, you know what G is and what he can be, but Joe feels like a little bit of a wild card. And if he's built upon what positioned him to be, tight end 1, tight end 2 last year, then, that's a weapon for this offense, I think.
I think it's funny because not only were we not ready for Cade Stover to go back and be that tight end, at this time last year, he still wanted to play linebacker. And so Joe Royer went into spring as like, he's going to be the guy. And could he and G. Scott do that together? And at that point, that blocking stuff for either one wasn't at a level that Ohio State felt comfortable. And like, Cade, this is where you need to go. And you've got to help Ohio State do it in this regard. I think I'm kind of amused. Like, we had all these conversations about perimeter blocking, and Cade was struggling in the second half of the season. And it's like, Cade can't block anybody in space, and he's not a physical enough blocker. And like, do you honestly think that there's not something else going wrong with him? That Cade Stover is not blocking people like that? He was put on this earth to hit people. He loves nothing more. This was a hip injury and a mobility problem, and not some sort of breakdown with him being unwilling or unable or incapable of blocking. Like, he was put in some, I think, bad positions by the play calling in some spots that were, I don't know if anybody was going to be able to deliver in some of the spots that they forced him into, but especially when he was hurt. And so getting him back and getting him healthy, plus another year of like actual full-time playing experience at tight end, I think is a huge deal for Ohio State, especially if they find somebody that can be a regular partner for him. I think that both Royer and Cade Stover are NFL tight ends, NFL caliber tight ends. I know that Ohio State feels the same way, and Keenan Bailey feels the same way. So what does this offseason look like for them? Cade had another setback there physically in the Peach Bowl, of course, and is working back from that. But I think that those two guys can really elevate the entirety of the offense. And as you said, like, sometimes it feels silly to talk about it because the statistical impact is just not going to show up probably for them. And I wouldn't pretend otherwise, but you look at the way that the entirety of the offense flows, I think it's going to be dictated by how good those tight ends can be, especially because there's going to be 2 new tackles working next to them.
Yeah, I think the tight end position is funny because it does feel like we talk about it too much relative to the passing production, and then people just like don't pay attention to it, even though the blocking is really important, until the blocking becomes poor. Like the second half of that. And I guess it's the same way as playing offensive line. You just like, whatever, they're doing their job out of sight, out of mind. It's like, oh wait, there was a mistake there. Let's talk about that for an hour. I think, which is fine. That's like the nature of the sport. But I think the struggles you saw from Cade Stover last year because of his injury speak to the importance of that position there. And I'm not by any means putting the struggles of the run game in the second half of the year on squarely on Cade's shoulders, because it doesn't belong there. There was a lot of things that were off there, but part of it was a tight end blocking. Cade was injured, not himself, and then they didn't really have a solid inline secondary blocking option because Joe Royer wasn't available. That just wasn't Mitch Rossi's strength for a guy who was 6'1" and 250 pounds and built more like a running back, as we said. And I just don't think that's G. Scott's strength either. So they were shorthanded there. This year, they should not be, provided everyone is healthy, with Cade and with Joe back into the fold. And even a guy like Bennett Christian, I don't recall Keenan Bailey getting asked a ton about Bennett when we spoke to those guys last week, and maybe he's someone who's not going to play a ton, but I remain kind of fascinated by him too, because he showed up looking like the guy that it sometimes takes the other tight ends 3 or 4 years to look like, a guy who's 250 pounds and is kind of a block first sort of tight end. And if we're in a world where they don't have a Rossi type of weapon to use blocking schemes that way, maybe they don't even have a sixth offensive lineman that they want to use, like they used Josh Fryer in that role last year and Donovan Jackson the year before. Does Bennett Christian potentially emerge as a guy who is effectively an extra offensive lineman? I don't think he'll be targeted a ton of the passing game, but if you're just looking for extra bodies to block and create angles and extra running lanes and help out these young quarterbacks, maybe I think there's room for another guy just beyond Cade and Joe and G as a receiver. I think there's room for a third blocking tight end in this offense to kind of make things go.
I think I can get away with this because Berm is not on the show this morning, but our regular listeners will know that I do not like to pick true freshmen as instant impact players because Ohio State rarely needs it. And the truth is that they really don't need that at tight end either, but there is something unique about Jelani Thurman's skill set that does have me intrigued. I don't know what it'll mean. I don't mean to get anybody's hopes up for a true freshman who comes in and makes a huge splash, especially at a spot like tight end that requires physical development, asks you to do things that at times are like a tackle and not just go out and run routes and catch passes. So I don't know what it'll mean, but Thurman arrives looking more like a big time physical tight end. I was going to maybe take it too far. He is put together. Okay. And he showed up, got to do some of this, stuff on the side for the Peach Bowl practices, was there for that. Keenan Bailey talked about him spending like every single day bringing in the notepad and getting a head start for the first 6-7 weeks on campus. I don't know. It's possible. And I'm at least open to the idea that Ohio State might want to find something for him to do.
I think so. It's interesting because last year I was saying if there was ever a tight end who was going to play as a freshman, that guy would be more like Bennett Christian because of his blocking prowess and his size. But like now I kind of want to say the same thing about Jelani Thurman for all the reasons that you listed. He's just like a freaky athlete. Like they don't typically recruit guys for this position who are built like him and have his athletic profile. And Kate Stover is probably undersold as an athlete. We're talking about a guy who was one of the best basketball players in the state of Ohio when he was in high school. Jelani Thurman is like that too. He's got really good leaping ability, incredible catch radius. He's a ball winner in contested situations. At least he was all those things in high school. I think that's the projection for him in college. The question I think that comes up sometimes with Ohio State is, even if you think he might be able to do those things as a true freshman at receiver, do you put him on the field unless he can do all the other things you need a tight end to do as right. a blocker? And maybe there are some people who say, like, who cares? Just put him in the slot and let him go be a receiver and the blocking will come along. Like, I can get on board with that idea, but it's just not the way they've done things. But I'm with you. Like, that kid, he's different. So if they wanted to get him on the field, I'm all for
it. Yeah. And it's, it can be a big deal for him. And maybe he can speed up that learning curve by being on campus and even the week or so that he got around the team in Atlanta, maybe that can pay off. I don't know. I don't expect it to happen because I've been covering this program long enough to know that it's much safer bet to say that it won't. But even the way he just walks around catches the eye. And I think that I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't at least bring him up, because we're also talking about a position that only has 5 or 6 guys in it that can play. So let's talk about them all. Like let's throw him in that mix.
Yeah, I guess the one guy we haven't talked about is Sam Hart, and probably I don't know. I think more of a receiver than a blocker. Although, like if you look at his physical profile, he has put on the weight that you want him to put on. He is on what I consider like the typical Ohio State tight end kind of career arc. And this is his, I can't remember. All these guys kind of run together. This is his 4th year in the program he's going into. Is that right? Or is it 2021 guy? I can't remember.
I'll check it while you go. But I think that is his 4th year.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know what to expect of him. Probably at best the 4th tight end in this offense. But again, if I were to say what I said about Bennett Christian and the potential to have a guy who's more just like a blocker, then Sam Hart can do that too. And he was on the field in the Peach Bowl, right? When they were had no tight ends left. He looked out there and Sam Hart was on the field for the first time ever in a playoff game, which speaks to the dire situation they were in. So they have 6 guys that like provide like a really good, I think like healthy sort of deep room for them. I think the biggest question is who can, I guess, work his way up to being the second guy to work alongside Cade Stover. But I will make a prediction. Jelani Thurman spring game MVP.
That's an easy one. Bold predictions in the book. People are going to be going wild. I like that. Make that in February. You can pencil it down. Sam Hart is, Bill, in officially year 3, but with 3 years of eligibility left because nothing matters in NCAA anymore.
Yeah,
so
it's all made up.
Yeah, so I think we get half credit for that, but who knows how that works? It's a tight end conversation. It's fun to. I'm always enamored by it. It's one of my favorite spots on the field, not just because my dad is an old school football fan who believes that the tight ends are open on every single down and that they need to play a much bigger role. So even if this episode is just for him and making it to the end of it, that's fine too. I can live with that, but I like talking about him, and I'm excited to see what Keenan Bailey can do in this full-time role. I know that Ohio State is too. That's why he's been around for so long. So there is enough to follow there for the Ohio State tight ends, and they at least deserve their own position preview heading into spring with Bill Landis and myself, Austin Ward. So that's in the books. I don't know the next one. We're going to try and hold Bill off on the offensive line as long as possible. It's like delayed gratification for him on that. Maybe I don't know how much longer we'll be able to do it, but we're going to try. We'll have some more of that on the podcast daily as we go along this week. Thanks for joining us this morning. Have a great Tuesday. We'll see you next time.